Thank you very much, Merlijn. I hope you can all hear me well. Bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity, actually the pretext to come up with this research, which I hadn't done. It was generated by this conference. Thank you, Merlijn, for your very kind words and introduction. Thank you for creating the opportunity to be part of this event from a distance. And finally, I would like to salute the many colleagues and friends who are in Versailles. I wish I could be there in person with you. Anyway, let me share my PowerPoint. Right now, I can only see myself, but let me know if, oh, okay, now I can see the video.
Yes, it's fine, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, as we heard yesterday in the last talk, Milton Pacheco's intervention, in 1580, the throne of Portugal was vacant. Kings Sebastian and then Henry had died without heirs, and a number of candidates presented themselves for succession. Philip II of Spain, however, was clearly in a privileged position, and in order to consolidate his claim, he set up a diplomatic campaign, soon followed by a military force that would smoothen whatever edges remained. Preparing his personal visit to the country, as we also heard yesterday, Philip ordered several royal palaces to be surveyed. Plans were drawn, and reports of the condition of each of them were sent to Spain so Philip could decide where to stay and what kind of repair works would be needed. After all, the last few years had been difficult for Portuguese monarchs, and most of the royal palaces had been empty for some time. Most of the documents that were produced in the context of this survey have been lost or remain to be identified, one hopes. But one of these documents has survived and contains information that is pertinent for this conference. It relates to the Royal Palace of Lisbon, which looked more or less like this around this time. This is a drawing from 1575, so right before Philip comes to Lisbon. The document I'm referring to lists, surprisingly, or at least I was surprised when I found it, it lists all those who actually lived in the palace in spite of the fact that there was no king either in residence or at all. The list mentions by name 15 inhabitants of the palace and generally refers to an unspecified number of servants. Since the document came to us truncated, it is safe to assume that several more occupied the palace, which, it becomes obvious, had not died with its last king, but rather was teeming with life. As is well known and has been repeatedly underlined in this conference, in the late Middle Ages and in the early modern period, monarchs and princes at large lived a nomad life, physically supported, among others, by a network of palaces. Princes, their courts and their servants would spend more or less extended periods in each of their palaces, and then they would leave for months, for years, sometimes forever. By virtue of this way of life, some palaces were altogether abandoned, fell in ruin, and simply disappeared. Others were judged no longer useful and were reassigned to other usages. A good example in Portugal is the Royal Palace of Coimbra, a city that was central for the Portuguese monarchy in the Middle Ages, but less so in the early modern age. So in the 1530s, King John III offered it to the university, which remains headquartered here until today. Other palaces, however, such as that of Évora on the screen, endured in the service of the monarchy for centuries. For most of their lives, the prince was not in residence. In the 15th and 16th centuries, even the Royal Palace of Lisbon was not graced with the presence of the monarch most of the time. So the question that is pertinent for this conference is, what happened to these palaces in the absence of the prince, in those long periods during which the master of the house was not there? Well, first of all, as shown in the document I referred, they were not empty. Documents like this, however, are extremely rare. For the purposes of this talk, the primary sources that I was able to gather together relate especially to a number of officials that were specifically appointed to maintain the physical integrity of the palaces and their gardens, preserving them from rot and ruin. Portuguese gardens, I'm afraid, are poorly documented, but even more so than buildings themselves, they needed permanent attention. A few precious documents indicate that gardeners were appointed on a regular basis for the upkeep of Palatine gardens, such as those in Lisbon on the screen. This is a tiny detail of a tiny museum in Europe, so the quality, I'm afraid, is not exactly stellar. Most of those mentioned in these documents were men, not women, and by most I mean all of the men, all of those mentioned in these documents were men, and they were constantly referred to as gardeners proper. And this statement seems to make little sense. Of course, they were gardeners, except that I found a couple of peculiar documents that testified to a slightly different situation. In 1534, an architect was in charge of the gardens of Évora, and this architect was none other than Francisco de Arruda, a favorite of two successive kings and the author of famous works such as the Tower of Belém in Lisbon. In the 1530s, Arruda was in Évora conducting works in the royal palace and, most importantly, building an aqueduct, a significant device for the upkeep of said gardens, especially since it brought water all the way to right next to the palace to a reservoir that has since been demolished. The water supply to the palace and its gardens depended on such a structure. The documents explain that Arruda was in charge of the laranjal, the orange trees, the horta, the vegetable gardens, and the latadas, trellised plants such as vineyards. And for that, he received an annual salary. So this is not a temporary, but rather a permanent position. Arruda was given some privileges justified by the fact that he was in charge of the royal gardens. And when he died, another peculiar situation took place as his wife inherited the office. She seems to have actually exercised it, as I also found the letter in which she renounced the office. This is therefore a unique, I think, case of an early modern woman, professional gardener in Portugal. Water is, of course, fundamental for the life of the palace, and not only for the gardens. It too needs constant and careful attention, and nowhere more so, apparently, than in Sintra. The palace sits in the middle of a mountain range, which is especially abundant in water, and water had been brought to the palace and incorporated into its architecture from its earlier building stages. The chronology of the construction of the complex structure that captured water in the mountain, brought it down to the palace, and distributed it through the various spaces remains somewhat obscure. Its earliest parts probably date from the late 13th century, and by the late 15th, early 16th, its most relevant features must have been complete. It is by that time, more precisely in 1476, that a new office was created, that of Master of the Water Pipelines of the Palace of Sintra, an office that is unique in the country. As was often the case in Portugal with royal offices, this one stayed within the same family for a few generations. Merlijn Rodrigues was succeeded by his son Juan, who kept the office for many years. As he grew older, he must have needed the help, or managed to get the help, of Diogo Rodrigues, most likely of the same family. His secondary role would explain a lower salary, a situation that was corrected in 1523. Juan seems to have held a firm grip on the office, and when he finally retired in 1526, he managed not only to retain his salary as pension, but also to recruit one more family member, his brother-in-law, Marcos Fernandes, who shared responsibilities with Diogo. In order to create some sort of hierarchy, Diogo's salary was raised to 5,000 a year. This duplicated situation was maintained for a little while more. When Diogo died, he was replaced by Gabriel Gomes, apparently of a different family, but making the same salary. And when Marcos Fernandes died, he too was replaced by someone from an apparently different family, Pedro Peixão, who also inherited his salary level. Gabriel, however, soon died, and Peixão managed to secure the position for himself alone at the highest salary. It took him over a decade to convince the king to let him recruit an intern, or rather at no salary at all, Balthazar Fernandes, who at least was compensated by securing the position for himself upon his master's death. He too had to wait for a decade to earn a paid job, but he seems to have convinced the king that he should retain the two previous salaries for a grand sum of 9,000 a year. There was only one more appointment in the 16th century, that of Salvador Rodrigues, who was given the same salary. Strangely enough, no more documents regarding this office surface, or at least I couldn't find any more, until a century and a half later in 1703, when Manuel de Silva was appointed for it. We can only assume that the office had existed in the interim and that for some strange reason, the documents simply disappeared. All archival records insist that the master of the water pipes had to reside in the village of Sintra. Physical proximity, of course, was key for his job, which consisted of guaranteeing the upkeep of the vital and yet so fragile hydraulic structure of the palace. In fact, that is the only information contained in the records as far as the job description goes. From 1541 onwards, an extra payment of between 60 and 70 reis was added for each full day dedicated to the hydraulic structure, simultaneously suggesting that the aging pipes might be in need of a little extra attention, but also that, in general, the office did not take its holders' entire time. From the same date onwards, the documents also mention that it was the watermaster's obligation to make sure that the water would flow properly whenever the monarch, the queen, or other royals were in presence. This sentence becomes formulaic and appears in every document after 1541, making it clear that the water pipelines did not serve the palace alone. Instead, they were also used by several farms and other gardens in the mountain range, which actually is still the case today. They too needed the water structure to be maintained, and they trusted their king to take care of that even in his absence. This is a very specific instance of the maintenance of the prince's presence, which happened in his absence, which happens to be fairly well documented. But at least from the early 15th century onwards, the kings of Portugal realized that they needed more general solutions for the upkeep not only of their palaces, but in fact of what Eloy yesterday called their geographies. They thus invented the office of the passeio. The term is formed from the word passo, an old version of the Francophone palácio, which was not used in Portugal until the 17th century. The word palácio was not used in Portugal until the 17th century. Passo, of course, means palácio. Just like the term cozinheiro, the cook, refers to the person in charge of the cozinha, the kitchen, so the passeio was in charge of the passo, the palace. I won't even try to find a linguistic equivalent for the term passeio. Actually, I did try, but I failed, so I will keep the original word. Anyway, passeios were appointed at least since 1433, when I was able to first document the term. In that year, a man called Álvaro Pires was made passeio of the Royal Palace of Lisbon, not Ribeira by the river, which we heard of yesterday, and which did not exist in 1433, but the one up in the castle, which we also heard of yesterday, which I'm showing you now. Sorry. Another very symptomatic document was issued that same year. The reason I call it symptomatic, and I mean, in the context of this conference, and Eloy, I know you're going to like this document. So the reason I think this document is symptomatic is that in 1433, a man called Martim Monteiro was also appointed passeio, this time of the Lusídia. The Lusídia is the name of a large agricultural area, extremely fertile in the valley of the river Tagus, northeast of Lisbon. The Lusídia still exists. It is still the largest continuous agricultural property in Portugal, and it remains in state ownership because it was originally a royal domain. What is symptomatic here is that in the very same year, the term formed from the word for palace, paço, was used to designate the office of the man in charge of both an actual palace, that of Lisbon, but also of grounds where there was no palace at all. There's no palace in Brazil, there has never been one. I think we can safely say that at this point, the early 15th century, the idea of the need of the upkeep of royal domains included, as suggested yesterday by Eloy, both built as well as other forms of property. In fact, a third document from the same year appoints a passeiro in charge of the palace of Vimeiro, which no longer exists, as well as of the agricultural grounds and woods that were attached to this palace. Passeiros were henceforth appointed for the royal palaces of Coimbra in 1434 and again 39 and 42, for Leiria on the screen 1438, 39, 41, for Lisbon again in 39, Torres Vedras in 56, Serra del Rei, which barely exists anymore, in 1483, and the list goes on and on through almost 50 documents that I could find until 1585, the year of the last significant document I found, in fact, appointing another passeiro for this palace you have on the screen. The passeiro's job description was very general. He was in charge of repairing, whenever needed, whatever small problems there may occur. The records frequently insist on the smallness of the problems he was in charge of. For big ones, one presumes, a master builder or an architect and their full teams would be called upon. Examples of such small tasks were sometimes even included in the documents, and they could be very specific. A beam or two in need of reinforcement, 4 or 5, but no more, if they are secondary beams, some roof tiles, if there was a leak. It is no wonder that passeiros tended to stem from the carpentry trade. Passeiros were paid, they had a salary, with a part in cash and another one in goods, wheat, more often than not, sometimes chickens. Their position could also lead to other social privileges, such as the permit to carry weapons, which was granted to the passeiro of the Palace of Leiria in 1442. This is all the more surprising as this passeiro stood accused of a violent crime. He asked the king for a royal pardon on account of his good services as passeiro, and he was granted one. This, of course, is no small feat, but it is also an exception. Perhaps the most important perk of the job was that it was provided with a roof over one's head, and I am explicitly winking at the title of Merlin's paper. Passeiros got to live in the palaces they were in charge of. In fact, they had to. The smallness of such tasks, which were nevertheless vital, explains why it was so. One needs to walk through a palace on a daily basis to notice a crack on the wall, a window that does not shut properly, tiny almost nothings that are so often the origin of much bigger problems. Two final curious references. The first to Ahmed, a freed Moor whose Islamic faith did not preclude him from working for the king, living in the royal palace of Évora, of which he was made passeiro in 1466. He must have been very old when 25 years later, in 1491, he was confirmed in the office through a document that praises his skills as carpenter and stonemason, and that states that he must specifically look over doors, locks, hinges, and doorknobs. He must have been also familiar with some metalworking techniques. Finally, not everything was smooth in the life of a passeiro. In 1483, Luís Vaz refused the position of passeiro of Serra del Rei. The conditions must not have been attractive enough, and a second choice had to be sought. And a few years earlier, around 1446, Martin Jansch was fired from his job in the Palace of Augustine for reasons not specified, but had to do with his incompetence. He behaved very badly, the document says. In spite of these difficulties, the office of the passeiro had served the monarchy well for the full duration of the 15th and 16th centuries. After the end of the latter, the 16th century, Versailles became much scarcer in the archival records until they altogether disappeared. What replaced them is unclear, but one thing is certain, leaky roofs and drafty windows did not. Thank you very much.